Hello and welcome to Continuing Clockwise, a channel about games, gamers, and gaming. I'm Chad. I had a request to talk about my current campaign in a little bit more depth, so that's what the next 3 episodes will be about. Today I'll touch briefly on my previous 4th edition campaign setting and go into my 5 principles of campaign prep and adventure design. Then I'll share how Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, Kurt Sutter's Sons of Anarchy, and Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers melded with Hoard of the Dragon Queen to guide the beginning of my campaign. And then we'll get into a little more detail as I cover my principles of session prep. Finally, we'll get into the beginning of the campaign itself, including our first player character death and ending with the birth of Halcyon, my current campaign setting. Enjoy. The prelude to my 5th edition campaign was my 4th edition campaign. And for that, I created a homebrew setting that I called Abulio. It was about 100 miles in diameter, so about the size of the Big Island in Hawaii. I wanted to keep it small and manageable. But then as the campaign went on, I sent them into space, where I had a bit of a mashup of Spelljammer and just normal 4th edition D&D, heavily inspired by Battlestar Galactica. I came to realize I had some principles that I actually was using, though I was slow to articulate them when it came to designing and running my 5th edition campaign. Principle number 1 is reinvest in new ideas, shrink the world. And related to that is to build over time. If I have an existing NPC that I want to use, a non-player character that's interesting at all, look for opportunities to bring those old characters back to lever the story forward. I had that old campaign setting from my 4th edition days, and rather than creating something from scratch completely, I prefer to reinvest in what I'd done before and expand it and explore around things that I've already done the work on. The second principle is the DM needs to own it. You're responsible for the success or failure of your campaign. It's a mindset that you really need to go into when you're either creating content or even using pre-generated content. You're the one who needs to make that story work. You're the one your players are going to be looking to make it all make sense and for the world to be tied together. No designer is going to be there for you to blame. The third principle that I came to understand was to use pre-existing resources when it makes sense. So that's my default. Use pre-published things that professional designers have put together. I've come to learn that professionals do a better job when it comes to adventure design, encounter design, monster design. A lot of dungeon masters really enjoy the design component, and I do on occasion, but mostly it's not my thing. So I lean heavily on published adventures and pre-existing things. Now, I reskin and reuse and repurpose very heavily. That's really where my creativity comes in, is taking 2 disparate things, merging them together and funneling them through my pre-existing homebrew world. I've done a lot of listening and reading in the D&D community. For example, Angry DM, I think, has some great adventure and encounter building instructions and advice. So does Matt Colville. And I can do that. I can design those things, but I've just learned that that's not where my interests lie, and other people do it better. The 4th principle that I follow is to use the good ideas. You will not ever be more invested than your brand new great idea than you are now. So if it works, use it. If it's not time yet, that's okay to keep it on a shelf. Tomorrow is not promised, especially when it comes to adventures and campaigns. Your group may fall apart. You may need to move for whatever reason. Who knows? Your creative process may take you elsewhere. So just use that awesome idea. Your players will thank you for it. And then the last principle for campaign design, principle number 5, is one that I am not great at, frankly, and that is to use your player character backgrounds and interests in designing your adventures. That will really kind of pull them into the story and make it all more compelling. Now, that's a little more difficult because you have to remember them. You have to understand your player characters on top of all the other work that you're doing, but it really pays off and is something that's worth pursuing. As the 5th edition launch was approaching, about 3.5, almost 4 years ago, I was rereading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. Cormac McCarthy is a great author. I'll put a link to his main page in the show notes. But that novel is actually called Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West. So it's not at all a fantasy book, and in fact it's set, as the title might suggest, in the American West. And this is the same author who wrote the novels behind All the Pretty Horses and No Country for Old Men, an Academy Award-winning movie that I loved quite a bit. In Blood Meridian, the protagonist joins this group of Indian hunters, and they're rewarded by the scalps that they bring back to civilization. It's pretty gruesome. You can imagine at first, as the protagonist finds himself caught up with this group, where this seems like an interesting adventure. These warrior Indians are kind of hurting people, and maybe it's not a bad thing. But shortly, it goes south for everyone involved, and especially morally south. This group that he finds himself with, and leads to him even doing these really morally reprehensible things. And there's a specific moment in the book where they come upon a village, and they go in and they really violently and really, again, in an awful way, murder everyone there for their scalps to then turn in for money. At the same time, it's handled in this exhilarating way, which is part of the beauty of it. It's awful, but it's also treated a little bit like an adventure story. Anyway, complex, and reminds me a little of Natural Born Killers. If you remember that movie, I think it was from the late 90s, written by Quentin Tarantino and Oliver Stone directed. It's the same thing where these characters, the protagonists, are really morally reprehensible. They're murderers. They're not good people, but the actions that they're doing are exhilarating, as in Natural Born Killers, as they're escaping from prison, walking out the front door. Levering that back, the idea that was really interesting to me was, what would happen if a first level Dungeons and Dragons character found himself in a similar situation? And that would be a really interesting way, I thought, for a group to find themselves together. So everybody joins some sort of adventuring group and finds themselves on the verge of doing something morally reprehensible. Not that they engage in those awful things of murdering innocent people, but maybe that's the moment where the good guys stand up and resist. And that's how the player characters would find themselves with other good guys and some immediate action kind of thrown into it in a little bit of an in media res. I fell in love with that idea as 5th edition was approaching, so I had decided to use that hook for my first adventure. At that same time, I was watching Sons of Anarchy. I think it was on its last season, or I was watching it on Netflix, so there was a time delay. Again, a violent show, which goes well with Dungeons and Dragons. So that show follows a motorcycle gang, and they have really interesting themes of loyalty. When are the protagonists, the good guys? And when are they, again, drawn into these morally reprehensible things? And the motorcycle gangs that it deals with really find themselves on both sides of that line. And that was just an idea that I found really interesting and really fun. And one of the themes of that story that I thought would plug right into what I was thinking was, what happens when a large organization, especially one that has some roots in violence, goes astray? When does it go from protecting people to hurting people? When does it go from just doing your own thing to hurting those who are not members? So my idea at that point was to merge the Sons of Anarchy idea with Blood Meridian with kind of classic Dungeons & Dragons. And I brought in 2 of the characters from Blood Meridian wholesale. So mostly it was the thematic, but I also brought in the gang leader, his name is Glanton, as an antagonist, and I also brought in the judge, and so the opposite of the moral compass, and had this great kind of opposite philosophy. Again, utterly morally reprehensible, really interesting. As 5th edition launched, I had the starter set first, and I had played at least the beginning of it, the first 2 dungeons maybe. I was starting to get a sense for what the game was like. And then the Player's Handbook came out, so did Hoard of the Dragon Queen, that first adventure. And so I bought that and read it, and was just really eager to just drink up any 5th edition content. And I really actually liked the adventure. I thought the adventure was really fun and also fit well with my ideas. So the initial chapter of that adventure has a cult coming upon a village, Greenest, and looting it. And the overall plot is that the dragon cult is taking treasure back to a central place in order to drive the ritual to summon Tiamat. So I decided to use that and just reskin some of the things. For example, that adventure set in the Forgotten Realms. I put in Abulio, brought in Glanton, and kind of reskinned him. There was a leader in that adventure. I don't even remember the name. And there was another leader, a higher up leader that used the judge instead of. But I also had bigger ideas for the judge, and I didn't have them defined yet, but I knew the judge was going to be my big antagonist for my campaign. And here, as I was preparing for that first adventure, I want to talk a little bit about my mental prep that I do when I'm preparing for specific sessions. And these are addendums to those other principles that I talked about earlier. The first one is I always make sure I have real clarity about the bigger picture. What are the bad guys doing, and what do the bad guys want? What's happening? What's happening off screen? What's driving? What are they going to do that the player characters will be involved with or not involved with? And then as I'm preparing for a session, particularly, I really focus on what's the next thing. I don't have all the beats planned out. I have the big picture planned out, and then I really focus on, okay, what's next? What decisions are the adventurers going to need to make? What are they going to be faced with? And then I can prepare the likely paths there. And then if I forget a path, I have that bigger picture to lean back on. So I've thought that through. So I know if I expect option A or B, but they pick option C that I hadn't even thought of, I can think of how does option C fit in that larger scheme of things. And then I can also prepare the encounters and the monsters for that really next thing. Review those, make sure that they're an appropriate challenge for the party or not appropriate, and plot that out. What will that look like? And I make sure that I understand the monster capabilities and powers. Less important in the first level, but now very important as they're high level. Monsters are pretty complicated, so I've learned that I really need to review those right before the session. And so then I launched. I called it Wild Abulio at the time. I was aiming for a little bit of a Wild West in Dungeons and Dragons feel. I don't know that that really worked, but that's okay. The reskin of Hoard of the Dragon Queen was pretty effective. One thing I noticed, and I think that's been widely complained about, and I agree, is that the beginning of Hoard of the Dragon Queen is not friendly for first level beginning player characters. It's just too hard. So my campaign rolled along from there. We used the beginning first few chapters of that adventure almost exactly as written. Fairly early, we had an almost TPK. I think it was maybe the third session, in fact. There's a first dungeon in that adventure. You're going in to investigate what the bad guys are up to, and the player characters essentially chased 3 rooms worth of creatures into the space that the boss was, where Glanton. And so again, it was 3 times the power of what was designed. That's one of the ways I'm fairly merciless. I see myself as a pretty fair and even player-friendly dungeon master for the most part, but in this case, when they make bad decisions, I usually let them have it. There was one death, and I don't remember even how they got out of it. One player character, again, the one that I'm sure was killed in that scene, had cast Tasha's Laughter at Glanton. He's the boss. He's got a huge ego, found really offensive. And then so when things turned around, he took his revenge. Also important is the human element, which is something I keep track of. The player of that character who was killed is a little bit of an alcoholic. So I know that he has other characters ready to go and ready to play at any given time. And he's got a flair for enjoying the drama of the game. So I knew that he wouldn't hate me forever if I killed his character at level 3. One way that I try to be fair to my players is that if their character dies, there is always a way to bring that character back. Some players are really invested in the long-term growth of a character, and I don't want to take that fun away from them. At the same time, death always has a cost. It's not just about taking the body back and having a ritual. There's going to be some long-term effect, whether it's a scar or some damage or at least a flaw. It might also be owing a debt to the god of death. Sometimes all of the above. And in that particular time, he chose to just start a new character. Shortly after that, I realized, and I had seen this coming, I realized that Abulio, being a pocket plane 100 miles in diameter, was really too small for the rest of that adventure. One particular section where the cult, which I had reskinned and called the Marshals of Mayhem, is hauling all their treasure, hundreds of miles. Initially had planned to still just do that in Abulio, but have them go from one very edge to the next. So I was losing the feel of the kind of island of a small pocket plane. I also was feeling a little braver and ready to invest my energies in a larger campaign setting. And so Halcyon is born. Next week, I will explain how I moved the party from Abulio, the pocket plane, to Halcyon, the grander continental setting. How I wrapped up Hoard of the Dragon Queen and transitioned them into Out of the Abyss, and what the party had to do to secure a flying castle as their home base. If you liked this video, please click the like button. If you're enjoying this channel, please consider subscribing, and I will see you next week.